Winston Churchill very famously defined Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But today, there are no riddles or layers of mystery to Moscow's intentions. When Russia began its military operation in Ukraine in February 2022, few scholars imagined that the conflict would still be raging today. Ukraine continues to receive immense support from Europe and North America, while the so called Global South has remained reluctant to pick a side. With both sides repelling the idea of settlement at this point, the fighting could go on for weeks, if not years. There will be long standing geopolitical implications to the world order. Today, on Geopolitics and Diplomacy, we examine the geopolitical impacts of the Russia Ukraine war. I have with me the Executive Director of Stratfor Center of Applied Geopolitics for RAIN and host of Applied Geopolitics podcast, Rodger Baker. It is such a pleasure to have you here with us, Roger.
Thank you for having me.
In a recent article published in December, you placed Russia's invasion or reinvasion of Ukraine as the most significant geopolitical event of 2022. 1 year into the conflict, many nations have adopted the policy of effective non-alignment in dealing with the war. Many developing countries are pursuing their own geopolitical interests. Does this indicate an emergence of a new multipolar world, or do you think this is just a reinforcement of the current power dynamics?
So I think that it reflects the fact that we have already entered into that multipolar system. What we see is that small powers, middle powers, frequently are able to maneuver between the big powers and find their own place. That's not sometimes without cost to them, but for the most part, we've seen that countries are not being forced to choose a side, even amid longstanding and often increasing pressure from the United States and the West.
Do you think history of geopolitics has taught us that conflicts are transformative? How do you foresee the new world order with a China-Russia axis, which is implicitly supported by the so-called global South again?
So
How do you make sense of it?
I would push back slightly in that I don't necessarily see a full China-Russia axis forming up. I think that there is a alignment of interests in some ways between China and Russia, and there's an interest in both countries in making sure the other isn't significantly undermined. So I think the Chinese interest in Russia right now in not actively supporting Russia, but certainly not opposing Russia's action in Ukraine, is because China doesn't want to see Russia collapse. That would open up a significant new front for the Chinese to be concerned about along their western frontier. The Russians, for their part, are very happy keeping China focusing U.S. maritime power on the Pacific, and we see that the Chinese are happy keeping the Russians focusing U.S. land power on the Atlantic side. And in that sense, we do see them coordinating and cooperating in some ways. And certainly both of them have an interest in modifying the global norms and the way the world works today, because they see that as very much a US, Europe, North Atlantic style world that doesn't fit with the way in which they perceive their historical philosophy, their world interests, their national interests. They see it instead as a world where they're forced to change or adapt rather than develop in the way they see fit. And so in that sense, I think there is an alignment between them. And that alignment does, again, as we talked about earlier, create space for countries to be able to maneuver between these powers and exploit those differences between the United States, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese.
Do you think China is well placed to be the country that brings Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table from the battlefield? We saw Russia, I beg your pardon, we saw China broker a very significant deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Do you think it is capable or in a position to do the same with Russia and Ukraine?
I think if you look at the countries of the world, if there is a country that at the moment could broker a deal, it probably would be China. China has strong economic interests in both Ukraine and Russia. Um, China has made it a point to largely stay neutral in the conflict. The Chinese have long-standing defense and security ties with Ukraine and with Russia, both of whom have helped to supply the Chinese defense industry. China has an interest in maintaining global food supplies and global energy supplies at a particular price range. And so in that sense, China perhaps has the ability at least to be the shuttle diplomat between them, whereas the United States, the Europeans, have clearly picked one side in the conflict and are not seen as being able to discuss with Russia anything. And that's been particularly accelerated by the ICC decision to indict Vladimir Putin.
Looking at the global issues from an Indian perspective now, uh, there has been a sense of displeasure from the West for India's position on the war. Do you think New Delhi occupies a significant space enough that it can influence this course of war? And what role do you think India plays in this whole conundrum?
So I'm not sure that New Delhi could fundamentally alter the direction of the war, but I think from the Western perspective, the US perspective, the European perspective, India is supposed to be one of the big democracies. India is supposed to be concerned about Chinese encroachment in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And therefore, there's a sense that India wants attention and support for its interests, but it's not willing to pay some of the price that may be necessary economically or politically to back up the West in this. And I think that does create a little sense of tension, but it's not new. That Indian relation with Russia, the Indian relation with China is a long-standing relation. India is part of the so-called BRICS bloc. India has engaged with the SCO. India buys Russian arms. So that's not a new dynamic, but I think that as the United States and some of the European countries begin to shape the Ukraine conflict as a fundamental global issue of democracy versus autocracy, and they see, for example, even Japan largely joining in reducing its exposure to Russia despite its energy security and things of that sort. They see India as clearly an outlier in what would be expected from this sort of large maritime democracy coalition.
Speaking of developing countries, it brings me back to Russia. Moscow has suffered significant strategic losses in the war. Do you think this makes space for other countries in the region, like Turkey or China, to compete for influence, especially in Central Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. What we've seen is we've seen Turkey already be able to take advantage of Russia's focus on Ukraine. So Turkey over the last several years has taken a much stronger role, for example, in the South Caucasus, and intervened and in fact, in some ways, actually supported the temporary defeat of a Russian ally within the region. And so Turkey has pushed in there. Turkey very quickly suggested the rapid expansion of the Trans-Caspian route for Chinese goods coming across the Eurasian landmass, so that if the war in Ukraine meant that Europe would no longer be accepting goods that were transited through Russia or through Belarus, Turkey would be in the position to be the primary distribution route. So we have seen that. We've seen China for a long while expand its economic influence, and even now, in some cases, its security influence in Central Asia. And that, in many ways, it's not the Chinese necessarily challenging the Russians at this moment because of Russia's dependency in, over focus on Ukraine. But in an opposite way, it's actually given the Central Asian states a sense of confidence to be able to sort of push back against Russia, try to get a little more distance from Russia. In that sense, I think that down the road, depending upon how Moscow comes out of the Ukraine crisis, there is space for increasing tensions in the future between Russia and Turkey, and even between Russia and China in Central Asia, where their respective spheres of influence now strongly overlap.
I agree. I agree when all of these countries are sort of leading to be leading for this anti-West front. These are very, very interesting times. I also want to bring up North Korea, which often gets lost in the war discourse of Russia and Ukraine. The White House has repeatedly accused North Korea of delivering weapon systems to Russia, while the Kim Jong regime supports while the Kim Jong Un regime support to Putin is quite unsurprising. What's remarkable here is that North Korea has repeatedly denied supporting or sending arms to Russia. Where How do you place North Korea in this entire war?
So North Korea, I think, has seen a bit of an opportunity in this conflict. The idea of selling, low-end arms, artillery rockets, ammunition, things like that to Russia is great for the North Koreans. They need cash, right? They've been not only isolated through sanctions and diplomatic isolation for decades, but during the COVID crisis, they basically sealed themselves off from everybody, which further saw their economy, under some pretty severe stress. And it's slowly been opening back. And of course, China is the biggest piece of that economic connectivity to North Korea. So this opportunity with Russia's interest in North Korea gives the North Koreans a way to build up some currency. It's likely that Russia is selling or offering at a major discount additional energy supplies into North Korea. There are some suggestions that North Korean laborers are moving back into Russia and expanding their activity in Russia. So Russia becomes a path for North Korea to violate sanctions, maybe to utilize operations in Russia, ultimately to reconnect to other parts of the world which they've been cut off from, and start to rebuild some of their international business connections and trade connections, which they need. Now, I think that the North Koreans like to pretend like they're not involved and not engaged, and so they make those statements. Oh, they are not selling weapons. They don't need that attention. But it's really interesting if you look at it. North Korea just tested another ICBM, and nobody noticed. Nobody's paying attention anymore. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, if North Korea tested an ICBM, everybody in the world would be focused on them. We'd be shouting fire and fury. We'd be worrying about nuclear conflagration on the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans are popping off missiles left and right, and they're left off in the sidelines. The South Koreans, the Americans, to some extent, the Japanese are paying attention, but the rest of the world largely doesn't care. And that's both good and bad for Pyongyang. The good thing is there's no additional increased global moves to further isolate North Korea. The bad thing is that it may be that their deterrent capability loses some of its political efficacy, and that may drive them to greater and greater demonstrations of capability, which may move us back pretty soon to nuclear testing.
Do you think North Korea will continue supporting Russia militarily, and it'll continue to deny its role in the future course of this war?
Oh, I think the North Koreans are happy to do this. Look, North Korea's, aside from international isolation, North Korea's biggest concern is the fact that they are so overly dependent upon China. And this is sort of an old Cold War play. The North Koreans are now cozying up to Russia in an effort, in part, to help their economy a little bit, but also perhaps in an effort to convince the Chinese that the Chinese maybe need to start doing more for North Korea instead of doing the bare minimum for North Korea. But I don't necessarily see anything that incentivizes Pyongyang to suddenly come out and saying, see, it's our missiles that are winning for Russia in the Ukraine war. I think they're just as happy selling arms without making any big noise about it.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very interesting. Roger, how do you see the balance of power shifting in the coming years as a result of this, the emergence of a multipolar world order, and what implications do you see for the global or regional stability?
Right. I mean, if we look at this sort of evolving multipolar world, there's a giant question mark over Russia. Europe seems to have come out of COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine with a little bit more internal solidarity and cohesion, greater awareness of their need to play a stronger defense role within the region. We see the expansion of NATO pushing all the way up into Sweden and Finland. So in that sense, I think that Europe is a bit stronger than how we saw them, for example, after the global economic crisis, where Europe was largely fighting itself, at least politically and economically. That gives Europe greater capability once again to try to shape global norms in their vision, which is not entirely aligned with the United States. I think the United States is coming out of this heavily engaged in the European Arctic as the place to hold Russia in, where the United States has a greater capability, but really trying to push its attention over to the Pacific and over to China. China, of course, continues to assert itself economically, politically, and we would expect over the coming years that we're going to start seeing China do what it's tried to avoid for a long time, but really can't, and that is play a role in regional and global security. The deal that the Chinese were making with the Solomon Islands, for example, for police deployments, some of the counterterrorism activities they've done in Tajikistan, that type of low-level activity is likely to spread. And the Chinese Navy is expanding its areas of operations, and it's working with the Russians. I think the big challenge to figure out is Russia. If there is some form of an arrangement coming out of the end of this Ukraine war where Russia still feels comfortable and confident, it isn't completely shunned and isolated from the world, and it holds on to some small parts, maybe Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, at least as in an unofficial fashion, then we can expect to see Russia focus internally, really push on its natural resources in the north, and maybe try to reassert itself along its southern periphery where it's losing ground to the Turks and to the Chinese. But if we see this as a conflict where the West sort of does what at times it is argued, that it should basically make sure that coming out of this, Russia never has the capability to do this again. There's no space to re-engage Vladimir Putin now, so there's almost a requirement for regime change in Russia. A weak or collapsing Russia could be a new major international crisis. Because what happens to Russia's nuclear weapons? What happens to the various regions in Russia if Moscow no longer has the ability to assert authority over all of Russian territory? That creates a lot of instability right along the Chinese periphery, right all through Central Asia, right up into the edges of Europe. And I think that would fundamentally change the way in which everyone looks at world power. You could start seeing the Chinese and the Japanese competing over influence in Eastern Russia, for example. People worried about what happens to Russian arms, trying to seize Russian minerals or mineral supplies or oil or energy supplies. So there's a big challenge there. But if we assume that there's some settlement where Russia doesn't completely collapse, we are moving back into what I would argue is the norm of the global system, which is multipolarity. And a multipolar system has more fluid rules, more fluid alliances. Trade starts to become focused on smaller blocks. If you look at partnerships between countries, they're not the holistic partnerships that we grew so used to in the Cold War or expected to continue forever post-Cold War. But instead, countries can have strong military ties with one power, strong economic ties with another, and political affinity with a third big power, and move around within those spaces. So we should expect a world that is less predictable, that remains globalized, but not necessarily with agreed upon common global rules, um, and a world where perhaps localized violent conflict becomes more normalized again as countries seek to resolve issues within their own near abroad.
That's a wonderful point. But how do you think this multipolar world suits for the stability of the globe?
Well, I mean, if we consider modern globalization as basically beginning in the 1500s, as the world becomes a single unified world and solidifying by the 1700s or so, multipolarity um, is the normal structure of the world. And what it effectively requires, as we saw with for example, during the era of British power, is some form of balance of power strategy. And the United States already largely pursues that as a strategic policy. The idea that you constantly work to block anyone from becoming too powerful and distorting the global system. And I think that is the way we see things continuing to work, that the US uses economic, political, and maybe some military tools to constrain certain Chinese action. The Chinese use similar tools to try to keep the United States put off. And so there's a soft equilibrium that is established among the big powers, but at the periphery, that's where we may see less stability.
We've spoken about uh, most of US adversaries, but it is imperative that we also touch Iran in this situation. How do you think Iran finds itself in the Russia-Ukraine war? What role can Iran play, uh, being a hostile state to the US and the West?
Yeah, I mean, I think Iran saw some opportunity in this conflict, so they could do arms sales to the Russians, which was of benefit to Iran. Russia looked at, because of some of the concerns Russia has with outbound trade, they've started to look at the north-south corridor, so Russia going down through the Caspian, through Iran, and out into the Indian Ocean region as a key trading corridor. So that creates some opportunities for Iran. But we see simultaneously, the Chinese deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia it doesn't solve any of the outstanding issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia necessarily, but it does seem to reduce the push by U.S. regional partners to constrain Iran. And so that has given Iran a little bit more space to maneuver, in spite of all the things that we've seen going on domestically, right? The social uprisings that have been taking place for much of the past year, all of those challenges. So I think that Iran has gained a little bit of maneuver room here. And in the end, look, when you have a major crisis in Europe, and China coming back out of COVID and the expectation of major crisis in the Pacific theater, Iran starts to drop down again in U.S. priorities. It's not the highest priority to go see Iran as a major competitor. Iran is not in the list of peer competitors. Russia, China are the peer competitors. Iran is a secondary or tertiary issue for the United States. And as these bigger challenges reemerge and become more acute, these secondary issues are going to take a step down in the way in which the US sets its prioritizations.
Both Iran and North Korea, according to me, fit in that block. I want to come back from discussing the multipolar world and the developing countries and their responses. I want to move slightly forward and just understand that in the early media coverage of the war, we saw hints of racism in the mainstream media coverage, especially by the Western media. There was a discourse and heavy criticism around it. Makes one wonder, was this special outrage, does it revolve around is the Western coverage of any conflict that happens outside of Europe is inherently racist? Is this a Eurocentric view of any conflict in particular, or of world affairs in general? What do you have to say? And I've seen personally countries like India and China and other developing countries get extremely defensive about the Western coverage of the war. Uh, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure if I, there may have been certain elements that would be considered racist or things of that sort. But I think what we often see is certainly there's going to be an Americentric or a Eurocentric viewpoint from the way in which they look at war and they look at conflict. And I think, though, if you look at anybody's perspective from their country, it's a country specific focus on the ideas of conflict abroad. The Chinese are certainly viewing this and discussing this war and conflict, and the way they discuss the American role and the European role um, is a way that identifies them as fundamentally different than the way China perceives things, the way China wants to act. The narrative that China frames for itself is sort of, they're framing the West in the opposite narrative, and they're using that and using ideas of colonialism and the like in their coverage. So I think that there is a natural tendency in times of conflict, for good or for bad, for people to view that conflict from their own interest and their own perspective. And internationally, that can be perceived as racist, as insensitive, as not recognizing those other perspectives. But that often happens in a conflict moment.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Roger. It was wonderful to have you here with us, and we would love to have you again and again on our channel. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Roger. Have a good day. Bye.
You as well.
Thank you for watching our conversation. Our channel, Geopolitics and Diplomacy, aims to provide a deep understanding of the power struggles, alliances, conflicts, and negotiations that define modern geopolitics and diplomacy. We believe that understanding the complexities of international relations is essential for building a more peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. I hope you enjoy our channel, like and subscribe it as we continue featuring expert analysis and commentary from leading academics, policymakers, and thought leaders of the world. Thank you.